Before we begin, I'm going to give a few heads up. The first one is a spoiler warning. I'm not really going to be talking about the story at all. It's pretty much all just going to be progression-based stuff. But I do consider progression to be so integral to this game that knowing what's going to be coming up ahead might damper the experience. If you're someone like me who feels that way, I'd probably suggest turning back. And the second heads up is that this is filmed before the special director's cut came out. I'm also playing this on PC, which currently has no confirmed release date, if they're even going to get this director's cut. So yeah, you're not going to be hearing about any of the new stuff that comes out with that. And allergies suck, so my voice might sound weird halfway through, so I'm sorry. But without further ado, let us continue. Death Stranding is a game that was destined to be controversial. You have the well-known and somewhat controversial creator Hideo Kojima going from a series with pretty broad appeal, all things considered, to then making a high-budget game that's straight up designed to turn away the general public. And as much as it can sound rude or up my own ass, I'm glad they made very little concessions for the broader demographics and made something so uniquely Kojima. There really is no Death Stranding the way we have it otherwise. It'd either be something watered down or kinda just a completely different game. And I'm not saying that just to say it. I'd actually like to explain why that is, because Death Stranding is a very special game to me, in both the good and the bad. To anyone who doesn't know what Death Stranding is, or hasn't seen much of it, it's a game focused exclusively on taking a package from one place and bringing it to another. That's it. This objective never changes at any point in the game, except for a few combat sequences, which are pretty infrequent. And these deliveries will usually last about 5 to 10 minutes at the absolute fastest. And there really are a lot of deliveries in this game, so it's not like it's some special event every time. And at face value, that might not seem like the most exciting thing. So here I am with this many hours by the time I finish the game. Yeah, I had a lot of free time back then. So how does this game stay so engaging, let alone for the 115 hours I put into it? Well, it's because this game is slow, and you have to travel great distances. Because of that speed, or lack thereof, they were given a huge stretch of time to fill, so they filled it primarily with constant light mechanics peppered throughout the journey, with occasional hard obstacles that you'll have to face. These consistent light mechanics, that also have some fairly big immediate and long-term consequences, help keep you focused on what's going on in the game itself. And this might be my ADD-ass brain talking, but I'm generally really bad at maintaining attention in games. For the most part, I'll play for about an hour or two, then take a break or get distracted with some shit posting on Discord for an hour, and then maybe return to the game. But this regular and meaningful interactivity manages to stimulate my monkey brain in just the right way that I never really put it down. I've often seen people call this a podcast game due to how quiet it is and how much time you spend doing tasks that you eventually gain muscle memory for. But I actually didn't listen to a single piece of media during this entire playthrough because of how much I valued the immersion and was sucked into this whole thing. So those light mechanics I mentioned, these come in a variety of little decisions you make constantly during your delivery. The most standout one is the terrain, as the terrain changes constantly under your feet. Some areas are generally pretty flat with little hazards, while others can be moderately rocky where you're more likely to stumble a bit, and some are pretty hazardous to try and go through. You are able to use your scanner to see the status of the terrain you're walking on, but the game also does a very good job at conveying which ground is more stable than others, so eventually you can eyeball it once you become familiar with a given area. But one thing the scanner doesn't do well is elevation changes. Even on smooth terrain, you can still end up taking a fall if it's a slight incline, or you can make it even slower to go over a slight incline than it would be to try and go around. And all of this is influenced by the next factor in your decision making, which is your cargo load. Depending on what you have stacked, how much you have stacked, and where it's stacked, it can affect a lot of things about your balance and movement speed. Generally, you really don't have to think about this much unless you have very imbalanced loads, which are easy to avoid unless you're holding something in your hands. The primary thing to think about is your weight makes it harder to do everything that isn't flat terrain. With nothing or even light loads, you can walk over very rough terrain just fine. With medium loads, you probably want to think twice about moderately rough terrain, but you could still do it. And with heavy loads, you really want to avoid as much moderate terrain as you can if you want to keep up a decent pace, because you're not only more likely to tip over, but it's also harder for you to recover if you do. When it comes to changes in elevation, heavier loads will naturally slow you down even more when you're going uphill, and it'll also drain your stamina faster. And downhill slopes become a bit of a double-edged sword. Normally going downhill is awesome because you gain momentum and can run faster for a short period of time. However, the faster you go, the more likely you are to lose control with your swaying cargo, which becomes more and more likely with the heavier load you have. So downward slopes end up slowing you down if you don't want to take risks and damaging anything. And the risk of falling is one of the immediate punishments I mentioned. If you're about to fall over, you'll end up stumbling and have to try and right yourself. Failing to do this will result in you falling over, and if you do fall over, you not only waste even more time because the recovery animations can be lengthy with heavy loads, and also you have to pick up any cargo that wasn't stored inside the backpack or on your suit, but also the cargo gets damaged. Damaged cargo isn't just a punishment for those going after a high score. It will slow down your progress as you gain less materials and less favor from shelters. And because increasing favor is how you upgrade various gear and is even required to progress in certain parts of this game, earning less favor can make the game go by significantly slower. And because this game is slow enough as is, going even slower is intrinsically a major consequence. Thankfully, all of this is pretty easy to manage. It's literally just pay attention. Either you use the scanner for terrain, learn what rough terrain looks like, listen out for windy weather, and understand how heavy your load is when approaching all of this. It's not as much of a fine gradient as it might sound, so you can get a grasp on this all pretty easily. Now for some of the more long-term effects. This is your stamina and shoe durability. These are a backup tool to reinforce good decision-making by making your life miserable if you mismanage them. Stamina works a bit different to how it usually does in games. Pretty much the only thing that actually costs stamina is sprinting and carrying heavy loads. Everything else uses a second endurance bar that is tied to your stamina. And your stamina depletes as you use it and doesn't restore on its own. You need to use your canteen to restore it immediately, or you can restore it over a longer period of time by resting if your canteen is out. But you can't really sustain this forever because a portion of the stamina you use is converted into fatigue, which lowers the maximum stamina you can restore yourself to. This can get really bad. If you're out for a long time and make a lot of mistakes, you can have as little as 25% of your max stamina. You can fix your fatigue by sleeping at distribution centers, shelters you find infrequently around the world, or any location you reached max rank in. But the latter two are a bit too uncommon, or can take a lot of work respectively, so just make sure you don't skip out on a good rest because distribution centers are static, but few and far between. You really won't feel the effects of stamina for a while, or even at all on short deliveries. But on medium to long distance deliveries, you definitely will feel some of those mistakes later when you realize you're now missing 1.5 bars of stamina and still have a long walk to the nearest shelter, or you're missing over half your stamina and you have to cross a really wide river with low endurance. It's especially worse the higher your load is, which can be a pretty frequent occurrence since it saves a lot of time over a long period. That's because, as I mentioned, high loads cause constant stamina drain, meaning you're now on a time limit as your stamina is depleting at an extremely slow, but not inconsequential rate. Shoes are much less gradual than stamina. You either have them or you don't, basically. They're mostly just an upkeep mechanic that punishes you for making mistakes. If you don't stumble often, you'll rarely need to replace your shoes, and it'll take even longer to go through the 2 free spares you can keep on your boot clips. But you'd be surprised how fast they can wear down if you trip all over the place, and God help you if they break and you don't have any spares left, because you take a big hit to your stamina cost, stability, and you even take damage as you walk. And those are just the minor mechanics that matter almost every second of the way. And again, while they all sound like a nuisance, they either require minor reactions or decisions on the side of the player to avoid, or their impact only occurs very gradually after about 20 minutes. And with some good management, you probably won't even feel them all that much. And all of this comes together to create a gameplay loop where you're constantly making tiny decisions and staying at least partially engaged all the way through while you get to the bigger threats, if you even see them at all really. And as a quick side note, if there's one thing I will say about this game is that it sets expectations really well. The first hour and a half or so shows you the pace of the game even through its cutscenes, which are often drawn out and silent. And you see most of the obstacles you'll face, as well as showing you the fastest and the slowest speeds you'll be going in this game, which just happens to be in line with a certain platform's refund policy. And now for the major threats. These are the ones you'll only really see depending on the route or just sheer luck. The first and most consistent one are the terrorist camps. There's 2 different types depending on where you are, but the one you're dealing with the most is the mules. These camps are static and are chock full of enemies who want the booty, or your booty. Once you set foot in this giant radius, these beacons will send off a signal that will detect you and send enemies to that location if they haven't seen you yet. The first enemy type are the mules, and they're pretty much just delivery junkies who apparently feel a euphoric high through the act of delivering, so they're only after your cargo and don't really try and hurt you.
They just want to smack you around with some stun batons to knock any unseated cargo off and eventually knock you out. If they manage to knock you out, they'll steal everything you got, and if you had any required cargo, you will have to sneak into the camp to steal it all back. And if you happen to not have anything on you at all, the scanners will largely just ignore you. When it comes to dealing with them, you do have a few melee attacks that can work, but only really if there's one of them. If there's multiple, running works. Unless you have very high loads, you can generally outrun them pretty easily. You just have to watch out for their ranged attacks. And you don't even have to worry about stamina management when you're being attacked because adrenaline kicks in, giving you infinite stamina until you can escape the area. But once you do escape, you'll take a massive hit to your fatigue, so it's still not a good idea to engage them at all. The other type are the demons, which are only found in the later regions and are quite nasty. They don't give a fuck about your cargo. They want you and you alone. And once they see you, they will open fire with their real-ass firearms to try and kill you. If they do kill you, they will still steal your shit, and because they're armored, they are a much bigger pain to deal with overall in direct combat. Thankfully, by the time you see them, you've gotten so many unlocks that they can honestly be avoided pretty easily considering they have guns. Both types of terrorists can be knocked out, and if you knock out the full camp, you'll be free of them for quite a while until they respawn. Now, you can kill them, since it also can be faster to take them out that way, but it's very much ill-advised to not touch any of the lethal human weapons in this game. For better or worse, this game is very dedicated to making sure the lore and the game mechanics match. And without going into too much of the lore detail, essentially, when you kill someone, you're pre-ordering a game over, and a huge possible progress wipe if you ignore it. When you kill someone, their body will start to rot over a very long period of real-world time. If you don't take it to a crematorium, then a ghost will appear where the dead body was, and will wander around in a small area. The rare NPCs will avoid an area that is known to have ghosts, but because they can't see the ghosts, if there's one outside of those areas, they could eventually get grabbed. And if they're grabbed, it's essentially a game over because, in the lore, if humans touch the ghosts, it causes a massive city-sized explosion. So instead of turning half the playable field into an unplayable field, they just give you a game over and revert you to before the ghost happened. I've never had this happen personally, so I don't know exactly if it just resets the world or actually pushes back progress, but I'd also rather not find out. At the very least, it's not a 100% guaranteed game over, because you can still get rid of the ghost yourself if you do find it. So, if you go around killing everyone, you're going to spend way more time taking them to a crematorium than you would if you just took them out with non-lethal weaponry. Although I'll admit, I'm not sure if they respawn after you kill them until they're dead. So on the topic of these ghosts, or BTs as they're called, they are the second major obstacle. They are static like the terrorist camps, but they only show up when it rains and are much more common across the world and also tend to be bigger. You can't really wait out the rain, reasonably that is, because it's fully simulated across the world and can last very long times. At bare minimum 10 minutes, and you can go well over an hour in real world time. And when it comes to dealing with them, well, their sense is based purely off sound, so it's a lot of crouching, moving slowly, and trying to avoid them. And if by chance you almost get caught, or have to get really close to one of them, you can hold your breath, which temporarily slows you down, removes your ability to see them, but lets you get significantly closer to them. Your scanner is going to be the most helpful tool when it comes to dealing with them, because you normally can't see them while you're moving, only when you're standing still. So while you're on the move, this thing will point to the nearest BT, and even indicate how close you are to them. Once you get used to this, you can kinda move a fair bit faster in these encounters, but overall, they're still going to be going at a snail's pace. Thankfully, you do have some equipment that can help you out here. Some of the equipment can outright kill them, or just force them to move around, since normally they're pretty much stationary. And unfortunately, unlike the terrorists, you can't really take them all out, because they'll pretty much respawn the next time it rains, and there's a lot of them. And if you happen to get caught, I'll leave you to figure out that one. A surprising amount happens, and it'd kinda be cooler to experience it for yourself. But essentially, there are irreversible consequences outside of closing your game before it saves, so be careful. But if you're curious and don't care about spoilers, it'll be included in the bonus stuff at the end of the video, since, I'll be honest, it is pretty sick and I do want to talk about it. But in essence, a lot of time is wasted if you get caught. So please don't.
But if there's one thing I'll say about the BTs and the mules, it's that while they're good obstacles, that's kind of all they're good at being. As far as an actual enemy goes, they're extremely simple to deal with and don't really offer too much immersion variety. Other than just, I have my tool, it's good against them, and this tool pretty much completely negates them. Well, at least for the mules. The BTs are much harder to deal with, but they're still taken out pretty easily with their respective tools. So add those major threats onto the other smaller mechanics and you have two huge causes of error. Chances are most of your cargo damage and time lost will be surrounding these guys. As a result, they are ever-present threats that you need to plan around before you even leave. If you have multiple deliveries in a row leading to heavy loads, is it really worth going through the mule territory? Or has it been raining a lot in BT areas? Maybe it'd be better to try and go around or carry some anti-BT equipment. But sometimes you have to go through them, so you need to pack accordingly. And that leads to planning, which is actually a huge part of this game. You can't always plan for everything because every scenario is situational, so even carrying one anti-BT weapon and one anti-human weapon is taking up a lot of space for things you might actually use, especially with those high loads where every space becomes precious. If you plan right, you might actually avoid seeing mules or BTs for quite a while. And this leads to my favorite part of the game, how this design space of keeping you at a snail's pace, filling your time with constant light mechanics, and throwing all sorts of various threats at you allows for a much higher level of satisfaction when you get a new toy to play with because they massively increase your quality of life, either by boosting the speed at which you do something, or does something that you previously couldn't. These enhancements are generally huge game changers in their own respect, still come with their downsides, but are always outweighed by the upsides. And despite how much they speed things up, it's actually not that overpowered because at the end of the day, doubling the speed of nothing is still fucking nothing. But jokes aside, the upgrades in this game feel so goddamn good that I've never been more excited to try out a new upgrade in a game, even if the upgrades in this game are comparatively really boring and mundane. And to get a better idea of how impactful these gadgets are, I'm going to start going through a bunch of them. So there's 5 different types of equipment. You have the structures, the suit upgrades, vehicles, items, and weapons. Structures are all handled through the PCC. Once you pull it out, it'll ask you which building you want to make. Some build on their own, while others require additional resources to fund its full completion. Once it's constructed, it'll take a portion of your personal bandwidth, which is basically just a total limit on the number of things you can build yourself. This is also where the most prominent form of this game's shared world mechanics come from. The bandwidth isn't actually that high. You can only build about 15 bridges total before you max it out, and for a world this big, 15 bridges in reality isn't a whole lot. But you also don't need to build your own stuff that often, as other players likely have placed down their own equipment for you to use in pretty convenient locations. I can't tell you how many times I wanted to place a piece of equipment, or needed a piece of equipment, and it was just there, because apparently some absolute Chad decided he really needed a generator up in the Himalayas. And because of that, you have so much space to work with that sometimes I'll just build a PCC in what I hope is a good spot, just in the hopes that it helps someone. So for the first structure, this is the post box. This is almost entirely multiplayer driven, as there's really little reason for you to use it for your own needs. These act like global chests that you can donate items to, or return lost cargo for other players to take or deliver in your stead. But keep in mind that any item you put here is local to that one mailbox, so random out-of-the-way mailboxes are kinda just a waste of space. It may not be the most impressive gadget in this game, but don't underestimate the impact it can have. I'm gonna go off on a little tangent here because this is a story I just love remembering. Despite having beat this game over 4 months ago, I still remember one moment vividly regarding a post box. It was at the start. I had to go up a steep, windy hill to try and deliver a package to the wind farm. My shoes were about to break. I was on low stamina, slowing to a crawl in the rain. It sucked. But suddenly, right before my shoes fully took a shit, I heard some funky Japanese music in the distance. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I rushed there as fast as I could, only to see a mailbox with something like 30k likes, and it had a jukebox installed. I open it up, inspect what's inside, and lo and behold, some absolute fucking Chad leaves a pair of replacement boots free for the taking.
I gladly accepted and put in all the spare resources I found, as well as some equipment I had on me. It's just a way to pay it forward. And then after that, I just took a nap next to the post box to get my stamina up, since I was also out of canteen juice, while just listening to the soothing sounds of the rain and the funky Japanese music. And that moment was courtesy of some random dude who placed a random mailbox that was used by some other random dude who stole a pair of shoes that just made my day so much. That was probably the moment that made me realize this game was going to be something special. But back to the structures now. The second one you're introduced to is the bridge, and this is pretty obvious what it does. It bridges things. And this is easily going to be the most desired structure, since it could turn a laborious minute-long walk across a river, or a huge detour, into a simple A to B. And as a little bit of a bonus, rain doesn't affect anything that's directly under it. So if you happen to want to leave some cargo or a vehicle somewhere where you don't want it to get damaged by the rain, just find a bridge and park it there. This feature will eventually be overshadowed, but early on it's just nice. And next is the generators. As you'd expect, anything near this will get charged up pretty quickly. This is probably one of my favorite gadgets to find out in the open, because sometimes you'll just be driving your car, getting really low on power, worried if you'll make it, while you're far away from any base, and then some either complete fool or absolute mastermind just puts a generator in the middle of nowhere because he actually came prepared, unlike you. And the last one I'll talk about is the Timefall shelter, which is a lot more situational, but in return, the effect is insanely useful when it works. It does what it says. The rain in this game is called Timefall, and it shelters you from it. It also comes with an unlimited supply of repair spray to restore the protective coating on your cargo, but most importantly, if it's outside of a BT territory, you can forcibly move forward 10 real-world minutes to try and wait out the rain. Sometimes you have to do this multiple times before the rain actually stops, but you can do this as much as you'd like. It's very nice for when you really don't want to deal with a BT area, and the rain might actually end soon, or you have a lot of stuff that's about to break from the rain that you can't really replace soon. And then for the next category that I'm going to call the suit upgrades. These are all wearable pieces of equipment that improve what you can do and may even add some special attributes. The primary ones are the powered exoskeletons. These things are awesome because they drastically improve your abilities in a certain field, while also increasing your max load and giving you some bonuses while sprinting. The general downside is that they do nothing when they're out of power, are a large size container when they're not equipped, which does scale down as they level up, and they take up your leg cargo mounts, so you have less room for easy to carry cargo. But despite that, it's almost always worth it to carry at least one of those. And while it's always a good idea to carry at least one, you do have to make sure it is the right one you're bringing with you. For example, the power skeleton is for when you have to deliver a lot of cargo to a place that's kind of a nightmare to drive cars in, or passes by a lot of BT zones, due to its dramatic weight and increase in stability while sprinting. On the other hand, if you're expecting a lot of combat or you're going through a lot of flat areas, the speed skeleton can be pretty good. The major downside to this is because you're going much faster, you're also more likely to tip over, which is why it's only really a good idea when you're going through flatter areas. But it does have one really nice benefit to traversal. While you're sprinting and you don't have a really heavy load, you're able to do a long jump which can get you over some pretty nice gaps like small rivers, little chasms, and so on. The next category are the vehicles. And man, the difference they make is just so nice. These are really good for getting between flat stretches of land really quickly, while also letting you carry a lot more cargo. And there's even a nice balance between the vehicles. While the trucks can carry a lot more and generally have higher batteries, they're not really good for moderately rocky terrains, where the motorcycles can still be really helpful there. Plus, the motorcycles are also significantly faster. But between the batteries, the fact they take damage in the rain, and that there's really rough terrain all over the place still, you'll be using your feet quite a bit. Probably the biggest reason you won't take vehicles is because of BT zones. While you're on a vehicle, you can't really sneak around BT areas since, vehicles make a lot of noise. And while you can outpace a triggered BT on a vehicle, because the vehicles are so big and the BTs are so densely packed, you're more likely to just run into one directly, which will immediately disable the use of your vehicle, and also you'd have to deal with a triggered BT. And another thing about the batteries on vehicles is that the drain rate gets increased when you're going across a rough terrain as well as through rivers. So some routes might just put too much of a toll on the batteries to really be worth it. Then up next we have the items. These are just general utility structures that you can build that are more often than not disposable and used for smaller but some pretty necessary actions. In it is just the ladder, the climbing anchor, sticky gun, and floating carriers. The ladder is your simple short-range bridge. It's super useful if you're trying to get across rivers since it saves stamina and is just way faster. But if the river has sections that are too deep, you will have to use the ladders because otherwise you'll just get taken away with the current. Ironically, these are more often than not used as bridges than they are actual ladders. That's mostly because the other traversal tool, the climbing anchor, comes in packs of 3 or 5, and they have much better vertical mobility. The only downside to climbing anchors over ladders is that you have to be at the higher elevation first to place the anchor, and if you forget to drop the rope back down when you're done, you won't have it available when you want to get back up. I really enjoy the dynamic between these two tools, and it's always a good idea to at least have 1 anchor and 2 ladders on you, unless you know it's going to be a completely flat area up ahead. The sticky gun is such a fun item that I ignored for the longest time before seeing just how good it is. It's a gun that is exclusively designed for bringing cargo to you. It has a massive range of about 50 meters where you lock onto an item, flick it towards you, and you have to grab it before it hits the ground. This can save you so much time for recovery missions where you have the items scattered everywhere, or if you just see some lost cargo down a cliff and you really don't want to climb up and down just to grab that one thing. And then the last one in this category is my personal favorite item. It's the floating carrier. I've never had such a deep and intimate love for something as simple as a fucking pallet with wheels, but Death Stranding can make anything awesome, it seems. This thing is basically a spare backpack that follows you around. And you could have 2 at once. You basically become a personal envoy of cargo. And if you then pair it with a power skeleton, the amount of extra cargo you can carry rivals some of the vehicles. The major problem is that it does slow you down even further, and you also have to be pretty cognizant of the platforms because they can get disconnected from you. They generally do a pretty good job at hovering over terrain, but really rough terrain has them beat sometimes. And I'll also mention this, even though it's not really that much of a downside, they do use a special resource while in use, but it's also at such a minuscule rate that it doesn't matter. They use about 30 of this resource every real-world hour each. The problem is, you can find this resource anywhere, you can hold as much of it as you want, and the amount you find on the ground is between 5 and 60. You pretty much grab one of these, and you're set for like 2 hours sometimes. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the single best part of this. If you don't have anything in one of your personal carriers, you can ride it like a skateboard. And it is about as risky as you might think. Going downhill, you can get some immense speed, but it also becomes so hard to control, and you also go so fast that you kind of will just die immediately if you hit a wall. And if you don't, well, say goodbye to your cargo. And the last category are the weapons. It's easily the flattest of the categories, and that's mostly because the weapons either try to one-up each other, aren't needed, or aren't even wanted. You have your basic assault rifles, shotguns, and handguns that all kind of do the same thing. Level 1 only fires the normal rounds, level 2 can fire the blood rounds as well, and level 3 just has some boosted stats and the silencer maybe. And unfortunately, the blood bullets to me always felt really inconsistent and weak compared to the blood grenades, which will pretty much one-shot a BT most of the time, with some taking 2. And you should never really need lethal rounds except against larger BTs, since shooting a blood spot with real ammo, or shooting real ammo through a blood cloud does allow you to hit them for more damage, but it's still a bit finicky. Worst of all, the first gun you get is arguably the best one, bar none. It fires projectiles with a decent range and has such a massive hitbox that you kind of can't miss. The downside is it only ties up enemies, so you do have to come back and kick them later to actually knock them out, so they can break free, but it still takes a while, honestly. And if you hit them in the head, it immediately knocks them out, so it completely removes this step. Technically, you can take out multiple mules way faster with a non-lethal assault rifle, but considering the mules are almost always in wide open spaces and engage in almost pure melee, you really have nothing to worry about. The demons can also be so tanky with their armor that the bola gun is still ideal if your goal is to just get away from them. But against the demons, the shotgun's also a pretty good choice since it can really stagger them. But with all that said, the guns do feel surprisingly satisfying for how little of a focus they are in this game. It might sound like getting a single weapon completely removes the threat that the enemies have, And that's because it kinda does. It made me realize, as I've mentioned before, that the mules and BTs aren't really there to convey some sort of survival horror tone, but they're just meant to act as an obstacle just like any other rock or river. Once you get a special tool for them, they become significantly easier to work with, and can even work to your advantage if you plan for them. And that's kind of a rough overview of the many different pieces of equipment in Death Stranding. I left out a few either because they were a little boring to mention, or to not give away every last thing. But with inventory space being limited and each piece of equipment having its place where it shines, you could start to see the thought process that goes into picking what you want to take with you on each delivery, or chain of deliveries, since you can only change out your gear, or get new gear at a shelter or distribution center, which are definitely few and far between. Here's one example of a chain of events that highly influences what gear I want to bring. So I'm all the way over at the Southern Distribution Center and pick up a few missions. One is to grab a ton of cargo from the coast and bring it back. Then I have to go to the weather lab to drop off some stuff, and pick up some missions which will take me to the Timefall farm. And then last, I have to go to the nearby river to fetch some items. So the first thing I do is check the route to see if there's any mules or rain, and there is going to be both of those things, so I begin to pack accordingly. What I end up bringing with me is 2 floating carriers that I will then put away immediately after the first part of this journey, a pack of blood grenades, a bola gun, and a sticky gun, with my frame of choice being the speed frame. However, I will be using the power frame for the first part of this as well. So immediately to begin, I will go to the coastline to grab those extra large packages, and thanks to the floating carriers, I can do it all in one go. Now imagine looking at this movement speed and realizing you'd have to do this with 3 trips normally. And because I have a lot of cargo to bring to the weather station, I'm going to be putting the floating carriers in the truck that will get me there. Once I get to the beginning of the BT area, I then take out my floating carriers, load on all of the excess cargo I have, and begin to sneak through. While I'm here, I'll try my best to sneak past the BTs, but if I ever need to, I will use the blood grenades to immediately clear a path. Once that's out of the way and I reach the weather station, I'm going to pick up some missions for the Timefall shelter, which will take me through a few more BT areas as well as a mule territory. And once I get past the BT area, now is for the mules. Once I get there, I'm going to disable their scanners so I can get by hopefully undetected, since I also have a lot of cargo with me slowing me down. But just in case, I have the bola gun and the speed frame in case shit hits the fan. And once that's done, I'll use my zipline network in order to bypass all the mules so I can go straight to the river, where I will then use the sticky gun to immediately grab all the stuff in pretty short order. And once that's done, I'll go return the last of it, and that's it. And that's the level of planning and forethought that goes into a game for something as simple as delivering mail. And none of this would really feel as good as it does if the base ability set you have wasn't so extremely slow, with your punishment for messing up just being a speed penalty. But as you build out your world and as you unlock more stuff to make your life easier and easier, the difference in time taken goes dramatically lower, to almost a decent pace actually. All while you start to feel like the Batman of the USPS, where you have a tool for pretty much everything you expect to counter. Because they filled such a wide empty space, caused by the slow pace of the deliveries with tons of minutia, each piece of equipment is able to take advantage of or be disadvantaged by aspects of that minutia, and all feel distinct in their own way by solving their own problems. And I spent this whole time talking about how the pace of this game had an influence on the game mechanics. But honestly, it doesn't just stop there. Because of those mechanics alongside with the pace, it also reinforces the tone of this game. It's about being a single man helping to reunify an entire country. You're alone once you leave the shelters, and more often than not, your struggles are with your own body than they are with someone else being a danger to you. Your own poor planning leading to your own downfall, your stamina running low making traversal a nightmare, you taking on too much at once, can all heavily impact you. And you have plenty of time to stew in those mistakes you make, think them over, and learn from them. Then before you know it, you'll have most of the country reconnected as you look back at the progress you made and realize just how much better things have become when you got help from other people. Building roads with other players, getting much needed supplies occasionally, or even asking other players to deliver things for you because you just took too much you could realistically handle. So overall, Death Stranding really couldn't achieve the same levels of satisfaction and game-changing unlocks if it was anything close to a tolerable game by the general standards. If it was, then the unlocks would have had to have been a lot more different, since you really couldn't get away with what's essentially incremental speed upgrades as well. And a lot of the tone would also be lost if it was a smoother and faster game, since being slow and stumbly is kind of the core essence of this game. Now, is it a fair argument that a game shouldn't be clumsy in order to do something? Yeah, I do think that's valid. But what's important in that argument is also taking a look at what's gained from that, and how changing it would cause the game's identity to be altered. I absolutely think it would change the game's identity if that were to happen, which would be a huge shame because the game we got is phenomenal. And most importantly, it doesn't waste the player's time. It simply just asks for a lot of it. It's probably one of the most expensive niche games I've ever seen, or might ever see, and frankly, I'm glad that it exists. So because this is a Kojima game, I couldn't not do this little bonus section at the end, because these games are always packed with so much goddamn detail. I swear I was about to have a stroke trying to figure out what to show and what not to show. But let's begin with the spoilery thing I promised. So, when you trigger a BT, what happens is they get really angry at you and try and bum rush you pretty much. If they do come into contact with you, it'll create a massive pool of tar that'll significantly slow your movement speed, while various tar figures will come out and try and pull you in. If you fail, you'll be dragged away and then be forced to fight a BT boss. Although when I say forced, it's a little bit of an exaggeration because it's much quicker to just escape them. And this revolves around various bits of terrain floating up from the tar pool because otherwise you're slowed to a crawl. But that's not where the real consequences are. If you do stick around to try and fight the boss or just mess up trying to escape, the boss can eat you. And as I mentioned with the whole explosion thing, if the boss eats you, it will cause a massive explosion. But here's the thing, unlike other characters, when they get touched by a ghost, they will pretty much cause you a game over. But if you do, for lore reasons that apparently your explosions are smaller, nanomachines, son, and all that, I guess. But what happens is, it straight up leaves a crater where that BT zone was. That entire area is now completely inaccessible. And piggybacking off of lore and the BTs, Sam's body fluids are apparently some kind of kryptonite for the BTs. As a result, you can in fact use the dedicated piss button to piss on a boss and fucking stagger it. I'm not even joking. Sorry, you'll have to excuse me. I lose my shit every time I think about that. Another excessive detail I love that's a bit hard to show off is when you hit the back button, Sam will just call out. And if there's any structures by other players or signs nearby, they'll respond, letting you know they're near. However, depending on the context, this can change, and this will even change at different parts of the story. So honestly, every now and then, just hit the back button and see if he has anything different to say. It's really cool. One of them at the very end of the game even kind of breaks the fourth wall a bit, and I'm pretty sure is a reference to Evangelion. And lastly, this one's just nice. So at the beginning of the game, you're asked for your birthday for literally no reason whatsoever. I could not find what this does whatsoever, except for one thing. When you play this game on your birthday and you go back to one of the shelters, there's a birthday cake waiting for you. And when you leave the shelter, a little cutscene plays of the character Mads Mikkelsen plays, wishing you happy birthday. It's just nice. It's just nice. I like it.